Welcome back to the final session on the cutting edge stage at CogX 2021. I'm your MC, Jess Wade, an Imperial College Research Fellow in the Department of Materials at Imperial College London. Please remember to share your thoughts and ideas on social media using the hashtag CogX2021. To close today, we could not be talking about something more relevant to the current climate: why democracy needs an algorithm. The past year has only emphasized the need for more transparency in our decision-making, our media, and our politics. So how can we leverage ever more powerful AI systems and nudge them towards more positive outcomes? To unravel this, we'll be joined by Cambridge University Research Fellow, Dr. Beth Singler, who'll be in conversation with the legendary Professor Max Tegmark. Over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Jess. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Max Tegmark. He is a professor at MIT, researching physics and artificial intelligence. He is president of the Future of Life Institute and scientific director of the Foundational Questions Institute. His research has ranged from cosmology to the physics of cognitive systems and is currently focused on the interface between physics, AI, and neuroscience. Max is the author of over 200 publications and bestsellers Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and Our Mathematical Universe, My Quest for the Ultimate Nature of Reality. Please welcome Max Tegmark. We'll begin with a presentation from Max on his current work and his current interests around democracy and algorithmic solutions to that. And then Max and I are going to have a bit of a chat about the app he's showing us and a few other issues. And then we're going to open up to some public questions. So get thinking while you're watching and submit those questions to us. Thank you, Max. Over to you.
It's such a pleasure, Beth, to get to join you from the other Cambridge to talk about this question of how artificial intelligence can help rather than hack democracy. Can you make sure my slides get shared as well, so I can share them with all of you folks? Great. So, of course, we have these great opportunities for artificial intelligence to help us. And it's pretty amazing when you think about it, how much the power of artificial intelligence has grown in recently. Just 5 years ago, this was the state of the art in robotics. And if we go from this and fast forward just 5 years until this year, look what's happened. Momentum. And not long ago, we didn't have self-driving cars. Now we have self-flying rockets that can land themselves with artificial intelligence. Not long ago, we didn't have AI that could do face recognition, and now we have AI that can simulate Beth saying things that she never said. Not long ago, AI couldn't save lives. Now it can by helping diagnose prostate cancer, lung cancer, eye diseases, etc., at least as well as many human experts. Not long ago, AI couldn't beat us at the game of Go. Now it can crush us both at Go and at chess. And the most interesting thing is not that it can crush human gamers, but that it can crush human AI researchers, people like myself, people who've spent decades handcrafting algorithms, which are now obsolete because the AI can learn better algorithms on its own just by playing against itself. But with any powerful technology comes not only upsides, but of course downsides as well. And as Beth mentioned, we're going to focus on threat to democracy today. Although some people worry about things that might happen decades from now, where maybe superhuman intelligence, superhuman AI can be used by few to subjugate many. Today, we're going to focus instead on the present, right now, where you might worry that AI can be used by few to kill many, like with the lethal autonomous weapons that hunted down people in Nagorno-Karabakh, and most recently revealed in Libya in this UN report. Or you might worry that AI today is fueling income inequality and making ever fewer own an ever larger fraction of the wealth on Earth. Or you might worry that AI can threaten democracy very, very directly by hacking the minds of all of us who vote, like Cambridge Analytica scandals and so many other scandals have revealed. For a deep dive into the mechanisms of this, I would encourage those who haven't seen the film The Social Dilemma to give it a look. And let's take a deeper look now into this business about how AI can hack our minds. And I think one of the reasons it's so easy to miss the biggest threats is because we worry about the wrong things. So I want to take a little step back here for a moment and imagine that there's this doctor, and a patient comes in and says, you know, I have fever, I have a cough, and I have a headache. And the doctor says, your problem is that you have a fever and a cough, so take some ibuprofen, some Motrin or something like that, and goodbye. Is that a great doctor? When you think about it, you realize, of course, that this is a terrible doctor, because the doctor is just treating the symptoms without bothering to diagnose the cause of the symptoms. In this case, the patient actually had COVID-19. So a much better treatment would have been steroids and supplemental oxygen if necessary, right? So let's take this mindset again, that we want to not treat the symptoms, but understand the root cause and apply it to democracy. So here, the patient, our democracy, is feeling unwell. There are a lot of symptoms that we all are painfully aware of. There's a profusion of disinformation. There's filter bubbles where everybody seems to be hating everybody, and people are living in these parallel universes where they read different newspapers and believe very different things, resulting in a growing polarization, making our society more dysfunctional and unable to deal with its challenges that it has. We're also seeing symptoms of growing income inequality and the growing anger at the establishment, which can be exploited by all sorts of opportunistic politicians. So these are the symptoms. What do we do about it? Well, a common reaction is, okay, let's just treat the symptoms. Let's use machine learning to block disinformation, block hate speech, so we don't have to hear anything from these angry people. Problem solved, right? No. This would be exactly as dumb as when that doctor gave the COVID patient some ibuprofen, right? First, we need a diagnosis. What is the root cause of this? I would argue that the root cause of much of this is actually that we are being hacked by AI. There has always been kings and other potentates in the past who liked to spread disinformation to keep their power. But what's new here in 2021 is the technology aspect of it. We have this machine learning all over the internet. And so the problem is that democracy works great when voters know the truth, but artificial intelligence is used to hack and disempower voters so that they live in all these alternative truths. And we should not maybe worry so much right now that the bots are coming to kill us, despite all the Hollywood movies. And although this is something you should worry about if you live in Libya or places where these weapons are used against people. But what we should worry about, everybody, is that the bots are coming to hack us, and that they have already arrived, that they have come to manipulate us, to not see the world the way it actually is. So what do we do about this? Well, I feel that there is a really, really good method that we have for truth finding, which we as a human species have spent thousands of years perfecting. It's called science. And this method actually works quite differently from the way Facebook fact checkers and so on operate today. Imagine if Galileo had put out a tweet saying, hey folks, you know, this geocentrism thing is wrong. In fact, Earth is revolving around the sun. And then the fact checker would have said, you know, nope, this violates our community guidelines. Pope Urban VIII fact checkers have determined that that's not the way it is, right? We fought really hard as scientists against this kind of approach where some self-appointed authorities tell us what the truth is. The lessons from science is we should never give powerful entities, whether they be governments, big companies, religions, any special influence in the truth finding. We should not do that. If it were so easy to figure out the truth that you could have some committee do it, then we wouldn't need science. the reason we need science is exactly because it's hard to find out the truth. So if that's the method of finding truth that I'm really excited about, science, then what's the tool? Well, what's novel about the challenge we've argued here is machine learning, the technology. And I think this also is a wonderful tool for bolstering scientific truth finding because it's free, you can give it to everybody, power to the people, you can make it scalable. So let me share with you a little bit of research I've had fun doing with my student Samantha Delonzo at MIT. First, to use machine learning to automatically identify news bias. So we downloaded over a million articles from over 100 newspapers and tasked the machine learning to just look at an article and try to figure out what newspaper it was from by how it was written. And it very quickly discovered that it was very easy by just looking how often certain phrases show up. You see, there's a huge difference. For example, if it's an article about the Black Lives Matter issue, then then media on the Republican side tend to talk a lot about riots and mobs, and whereas media more on the left, they tend to talk more about demonstrators and protests. And the machine learning, with no human input whatsoever, was able to classify newspapers into a spectrum like this, where when you look at it as a human, you're like, oh, look, it put left-leaning newspapers on the left and right-leaning ones on the right. But we didn't tell it to do that. It did that just by looking at how often phrases appeared. And it also learned all by itself which phrases to pay attention to. So here you see that it discovered that, again, if it talks much more about demonstrators, it's probably on the left, more about rioters, more on the right. But this works automatically for all sorts of issues. When we gave it abortion articles, it found that articles that talk a lot about unborn babies are more likely to be on the right, bias-wise, and articles that talk more about a fetus instead of an unborn baby are more likely to be on the left. And you have all these synonyms where journalists have the ability to choose between different phrases that kind of mean the same thing, whether you talk about asylum seekers or undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants or illegal aliens. But the machine learning discovers that which of those you pick reflects very much how the journalist is trying to bias the reader to feel about these things. And even though conceptually you might think abortion has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, the bias the machine learning finds for different newspapers shows that they're almost perfectly correlated between these issues. That's why this big correlation matrix, never mind the labels, is showing very strong correlation between all sorts of issues in the block on the upper left, which corresponds to all the issues where we have the traditional left versus right bias. It's so familiar to us. But there's also another big yellow block of other topics, which are very correlated in their bias, which are sort of independent of this left-right. So there's another second axis of bias. What is that? Well, let's look at this example. Nuclear weapons, that issue, machine learning discovered is very biased there. But here you can see it hasn't separated at all between the red and the blue newspapers, between the left and the right. Instead, it separated the big newspapers from the small newspapers. The big mainstream ones at the top here, they talk a lot about nuclear deterrent and stuff like that. Whereas there are a lot of small anti-establishment ones at the bottom, which talk instead about nuclear war and nuclear weapons, which get surprisingly little mention in the mainstream press. So this is the establishment bias. And it shows up in many other topics, again, auto-discovered, where you have, for example, on military funding, mainstream newspapers like to talk a lot about defense spending, and whereas on the right, on the anti-establishment newspapers tend to talk more about the military budget and Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. And again, very strong correlations between all the different topics, whether they're more sort of anti-establishment or pro, but nothing to do with left-right. You can see Fox News is sitting here right next to the New York Times in the lower left, very similarly biased, more sort of pro-establishment, whereas the American Conservative on the right is sitting right next to Alternet, which is very left, in the anti-establishment media. So in summary, what do we do with all this? Well, we don't want, my vision is that machine learning should really be able to not just be used like today by the very powerful to manipulate all of you, which is mainly how it's used in media. Of course, the big companies are using machine learning to manipulate you mainly to maximize your screen time and watch as many ads as possible by pressing all your emotional buttons, getting you angry and feeding you things that are going to make you watch for a long time. It can just as well be given away for free by nonprofit organizations that give tools to you all that can help you spot bias, see through bias. So as one example, this is something we started developing here at MIT. You can download for free if you go to if you go to the Google Play Store. If you're an Android person, there's an app called Improve the News. You can get it on your iPhone at the Apple Store, Improve the News, or you can just go to the website, improvethenews.org. And let me just take my last minute here and give you a very quick look at it so you can get a flavor for what it actually does. As an example of how I feel those of us in the who work on machine learning should give away free tools to make the benefits available more broadly. So let's go surfing the web, but let's just go to improvethenews.org. So basically here, instead of just seeing the news like in a normal news aggregator like Google News, you can very, very easily see the bias by picking some topic that you're interested in, maybe immigration, and then say, okay, what are they saying about this on the left by dragging this slider? What are they saying about it on the right? Oh, totally different news, totally different spin. What are the pro-establishment media saying about it? Oh, they're saying this. What are the anti-establishment media saying about this? Oh, here are a bunch of newspapers I never heard about because they're much smaller and you don't find them on Google News. So the idea here is, as I said, to just provide free tools to people that let them be more in charge, let you all be more in charge of how you navigate the information gathering in democracy. And I hope if you find this useful, you'll send me lots of emails and telling us here how we can make this better. And to just wrap up, I think a key message is that to make democracy flourish with ever more powerful technology, such as artificial intelligence, it is to really develop tools for people that we can give away for free because they're developed by nonprofits and universities and so on to empower everybody. Powerful AI doesn't have to be something that all the big guys and the big companies and the big governments have monopolies on. And I think if we do this, we can actually strengthen rather than weaken our democracy with this. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Max. We're going to move on now to a discussion between the two of us, and then we'll open up to some questions from the public, and I can see a couple coming through already. So I'm very interested in the uptake in this app and whether you see it as scalable. So I think initially, you're going to have two kinds of users, a very self-selecting group that do indeed want to see both sides and use the slider, but also those that want to be able to choose the news that does reinforce their views. How do you get this out to those who are comfortable in their current news providers and don't want to see the other side of the discourse? And how do you get them to flip that switch? How do you get this to scale up?
I think this is a great question. Is this just going to exacerbate the problem? And actually, there's some very interesting research from my MIT colleague, David Rand, suggesting that we should trust people more in their choices than we do. It's very convenient for big companies to just blame all the problems on the individual users, right? Tobacco companies, can you still see me? Mm-hmm. Tobacco companies used to do this and say, oh, don't blame us for children smoking. It's just them being dumb and making these choices. And in the same way, it's very convenient for big tech today to say, oh, just blame these users for being so dumb and getting into their filter bubbles. But what David Rand's research showed is if you actually make it easy for people to get access to alternative points of view that are nuanced, they're actually quite interested in it. If you're doing a startup company and your friend tells you, Beth, I think this is not going to work. And do you want to know why? Are you going to want to hear it? Or are you going to be like, go away, I want to stay in my bubble? Mm-hmm. So the challenge is, right, though, if you just go today on this crazy internet out there and go to some opposing newspaper, you're going to be insulted within 10 seconds because they take your favorite politician, put a deliberately ugly picture of them, and then do some very aggressive wording around it, right? So it's not the sort of nuanced contrarian information that we're emotionally ready to take up. And what I want to do is make it easier for people to find actually nuanced, balanced information showing other people, other point of view. Is that, and David Rand's research suggests that there will be a real appetite for that, and data will prove me wrong if it's not so.
Yeah, I think it's useful to think about those dichotomies of left and right and where people are placed and where they place themselves. I think certainly I'm talking from the UK context because that's the one I know better, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily label themselves with those terms, but they label others with them. So they indicate towards the left or they indicate towards the right. So is the left-right dichotomy, or even, as you say, the pro and anti-establishment dichotomy, really reflect how people live their lives? Are they going to find themselves not represented by your app in that way?
I think it's this idea that we should all put ourselves in all these different buckets is fundamentally very unhealthy for a democracy. It's most discussions get so much more clear if you just take a very concrete factual issue. You know, what do you think about this? What should the speed limit be here in Oxford on this street? You know, rather than bucketing people. In fact, bucketing people, I think, is like Julius Caesar used to say, one of the most popular divide and conquer tools. If very few people want to oppress a very large group, how do they do it? They divide them into buckets and make them hate each other. So if you want to be really cynical, you could say, well, maybe what's happening now is we have this enormous income inequality. So no party is ever going to win an election by saying, you know, lower taxes on the rich, yay, you know. But instead, they can maybe make maybe if they can make people of color and white people hate each other over some issues, people who are religious hate people who are not, and people who are not so religious hate each other on some other issues, make people who live in big cities and people who live in the countryside hate each other over gun issues and other issues. And by now, you know, they've divided everybody who would want to raise taxes on the rich to hate each other, and status quo. Mm-hmm. I think the more we can get away from putting labels on each other like this, I think the healthier it is for democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was thinking as well, I don't know if you're familiar with this nursery rhyme. It's one I grew up with, and perhaps I don't know if it's transglobal, but there was the nursery rhyme about the woman who swallowed a fly and then swallowed a spider to catch the fly, and then swallowed a bird to catch the spider that swallowed. And there's a progression. And I wonder if we can think of questions around, you know, tech solutionism. Is this an attempt to solve a problem caused by tech by layering yet more tech on top of the original problem?
That's a very good and painfully important question, I think. Certainly, if we have to be mindful of it. For instance, if we humans first say, okay, let's first mess up our atmosphere by putting all this carbon dioxide in it, and then let's try to fix that by blocking out the sun with geoengineering. That makes me feel, wait a minute, maybe we should just stop messing things up so much in the first place. In the case of the mass media, I think realistically, there is no way that machine learning is just going to disappear. It's completely unrealistic to say, let's stop technology. So for better or worse, the only realistic way to make things better is to make sure that we use these same technologies and steer them towards better uses than right now. And again, I think many people don't realize that whereas it's pretty obvious that huge companies are going to have a monopoly on having enormous warehouses and owning freight container ships and so on because they're expensive. There's no reason why big companies and big governments should have a monopoly on having powerful AI, because it's just a bunch of code. Anyone can own it. It can be free. And that can be incredibly empowering. I mean, think about how empowering something like Wikipedia has been in the past, right? Where it just took something which you used to have to pay money to get, like buy dictionaries and such, and just gave it to everyone. And I think I would encourage us to all think about ways in which that can be generalized, how you can give away other free machine learning based tools to absolutely everybody to empower them.
I mean, of course, there's an epistemic hazard in those sorts of open access tools. You mentioned Wikipedia, with sort of editing wars going off as people fight to determine what the actual factual truth is that's represented on the Wikipedia page, and that could be another aspect to this as well.
Yeah, that's true. There's always risk to everything. You think I'm too much of a sucker for democracy here, but there are certainly been governments who said, okay, let's solve this by banning Wikipedia because it's too dangerous for people to have access to all this information. I think that goes exactly against the whole spirit of science, where you want to put some trust into people and let people have a free discourse and sort of see what happens. And I'm kind of willing to gamble on democracy here also, and give people access to better tools for figuring out, what's actually going on in the world.
I'm aware I'm probably coming across as quite a cynic about human nature, and as an anthropologist, that's not necessarily a great position to take. But I did warn Max before we started that I was going to play devil's advocate for this discussion, so he knows I'm not entirely one-way inclined in my opinions. You also said that we should never give powerful entities special influence over fact-checking. So that goes on to the point you were just making, and you were talking about states and institutions and religions and dominant classes and demographics. But doesn't that also include powerful automated decision-making systems and content evaluators like this machine learning system that you propose?
If it were the case that there's just some sort of oracle bot which everybody's told to trust, and then tells everybody, this is the truth. After analyzing 5 gigabytes of data, I have decided that Beth is a threat to England.
It's probably true.
Yeah. Then we're talking exactly about ceding power to the machines. That's not at all what I'm advocating. I'm talking about very transparent tools that once you've got the information, you have other ways of checking if it's actually true or not, right? It's more like, oh, this big company tells me that their product is perfectly safe, that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer, and asbestos is the safest thing ever. And my government tells me that they're not corrupt at all, and that there is no embezzlement of tax funds here in this thing. If you have some system, it doesn't really matter whether it's automated or whether it's just a good old investigative journalism effort that tells you, hey, this politician is lying, and look, here's a bunch of evidence. The hard part was finding the evidence in the first place. Once the evidence has been presented, it's very easy for anyone who wants, if it's ideally to go check that this actually is the case. This is a very basic premise of science also, right? It's very hard to discover things for the first time, but once someone discovers it, then they explain to the rest of the world how they can repeat the experiment, and how they can check things for themselves. So scientists never ask you to believe them just because they have a fancy title. They ask you to believe them because they say, here's how you can check for yourself if this is true. And this is the role I would like to see machine learning play here in societal truth finding as well.
That, I feel, moves nicely into the next question I was going to ask, but I also see that someone in chat has asked that from the public listening, has asked basically the same question. So I'm going to ask their question and then move on to the other public questions now. So they say, to what extent is science really immune from control by vested interests? Do you have any sympathy for the view of the sociology of science, emphasizing how broader culture often constrains new ideas?
I have a lot of sympathy for critics of science who say that scientists are also biased. And of course, I'll be, as a scientist, the first to admit that science has often been kind of corrupted. I mean, look at what happened with people who were funded by the tobacco industry to write articles about how lung cancer was actually caused by pet birds. Yeah, you can go look it up. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that all humans can be corrupted. And in fact, the least corrupt truth-finding effort we have so far has been science. That's why some scientists you have had scientists even burnt at the stake or thrown in prison because they were just so annoying for these powers who were trying to corrupt them. And it's not the scientists we should defend. There are always rotten eggs in any group, but it's the ideas of it, right? For example, the idea of freedom of speech, that scientists should be able to call out falsehoods regardless of who's saying them, and they should be able to accuse even Pope Urban VIII of having an incorrect claim about solar system, or the president of a country. That's why I'm so negative to some of this censorship we're seeing now from big tech. And another principle which I think is really important is that in science, trust is earned by making correct predictions, right? It doesn't matter how many fancy titles you have, how many PhDs you have. If your last 3 papers predicted things that were wrong, no one is going to take you seriously. And conversely, there have been scientists who came totally out of left field. They didn't even have any education, but they just predicted some amazing things which turned out to be right. And then after that, they were like rock stars and people took them very seriously. In contrast, politicians today usually don't have trust that they've earned in the same way by making repeated predictions about what was going to happen if they did this and that policy and proven true.
Okay, so moving on to another question from the public audience. Is there a way for democracy to have a barrier to entry, not money, but ethical or moral boundary?
Certainly. I think sunshine is generally the best medicine for ethical behavior, right? Because unethical behavior is very much like cockroaches. It really thrives in darkness, If you want less corruption, well, then get a lot of local journalists, investigative journalists who write articles about the corruption, and magically there'll be less of it. And you see, sure enough, that in systems where there's a lack of investigative journalism that speaks truth to power, and in those societies, in those times, you get way more unethical behavior. And it goes on all scales, from the most petty city councillor who takes a bribe, to at the very largest scales where we have world leaders doing really reckless things with all of humanity. Like we've almost had humanity destroyed multiple times over with accidental nuclear war because some politicians were being very reckless and underestimated the risk of mistakes. But because there's so little attention to this, as I showed you in that plot, right, in the mainstream media, we don't even hear about it very much, and there's really no accountability. So good journalism that leads to accountability, I think, is a good strategy for a more ethical world.
Okay, good. Another question. A news is a news, ultimately. Can we not train the algorithm to just filter out the news from the left or right biased articles and present the core news?
So one of the most shocking things I feel I actually learned by staring at all this machine learning output was that the biggest problem in our media ecosystem today is not fake news, which is itself a big problem, but which you could, of course, try to tackle by filtering things out. But an even bigger problem is just omissions, the things that just are not mentioned at all, right? Because it's and when you compare what you read in Fox or here on Fox News with CNN, or for those of you in Britain, The Guardian on the left versus something on the right, the biggest differences are just what they don't talk about. And that cannot be solved by filtering out things, because then there'll be even less talked about. That you notice instead when you look at both sides and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this newspaper here never talks about the fact that there's a famine going on in Yemen right now, and that there's a child dying every 11 minutes, and that we could stop it if we wanted to, but we're not. But I know about it because I saw it in this other newspaper.
Okay, so I have a question here. If journalists have always been skilled at using language to influence their audiences, might NLP tools be able to reshape the language to recenter the debates? And how often would you need to update the machine learning model to account for such changes in language across papers? Seems like a big
Well, that's great. Actually, my student Samantha, who I gave a shout out to for working with me on this research, is actually building a tool that does exactly this. Hopefully we'll release it this summer, where you read an article and then it highlights for you all these buzzwords, which are typically chosen to bias you to either think one way or the other, and then give you a little slider so you can slide it and see what would this article look like, this article that came from, say, Breitbart News, if it were in fact a CNN article instead. So you can just see the word changes. So hopefully we can put something like that on improvethenews.org later this summer.
Okay, so there's something to look forward to as well. Just a couple more questions. We've got about 4 minutes left. A slightly more technical question. Can Solid Internet Protocol by Tim Berners-Lee blockchain protect our data privacy from artificial intelligence?
That's a very good question. I'm a strong supporter of building this sort of privacy protecting infrastructure from the ground up, and I think there's one example of a very good idea. I think our internet has been gradually getting more secure in recent years, also when we switched from HTTP to putting a little S at the end there with encryption. But we complement the technology also by updating our laws to be up to speed for this. Because right now, the laws both in the United Kingdom and the US, I think, are very much not strong enough to protect privacy. For example, we just had this huge scandal in America, right, where the US government told Apple to spy on emails from a bunch of lawmakers on one particular party, because at that point the Department of Justice was controlled by the other party, and Apple was like, okay, it's a court of law that said it, so here you go, here's your data. There was no technology Apple could use in that case to prevent it, but a change in law could, if we just have a law saying that actually democracy works better if nobody can get so much power that they're allowed to do something like the Watergate and spy on their political opponents legally, then that's a big win. So ask your own elected officials, whatever country you're in, where their stance is on laws. Do they want to ban various forms of cryptography like France has been pushing? Or do they want to have laws that safeguard the privacy of journalists, of politicians on all sides, and so on?
So I think we have time for just the last question, which I think is sort of like the overarching question of the session, I suppose, come from the public audience. How can democracy, power of the people, not be hacked with AI, big data, power of the few?
Yeah, I love how you're ending with this, because this is really the thematic question of the whole conversation. If we start on the opposite end, if you want to really squelch the little person, no power to the people, all power to the few, how would you accomplish that? Well, you would make sure that all powerful machine learning systems are so expensive that only the few can have them. And maybe you even want to ban the many from using things that would empower them, like when France is trying to ban strong cryptography, right? To really safeguard that the few can dominate the many. So the answer to your question is just do exactly the opposite of what I said, right? Have legal protection, first of all, that doesn't, so that the many can use the same tools that the few can use legally. And second, there is so much idealism in the community of AI researchers out there, both in universities and then philanthropically funded organizations and in big tech companies as well. So let's encourage all of those people to, in addition to the commercial stuff they do, also create free tools like Wikipedia, but also to other free tools, and just give them away, open source them, and make them available to everybody. That way, we are not overpowering the ordinary voter in person, but we're empowering them. That's the future I would like to see.
Well, thank you so much, Max. It's been such an interesting conversation. I have pages and pages of more questions I could have got to. I'm glad that we got to all the questions that I could see from the audience. I think that's the key thing. So my thanks, and thanks for everyone for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Beth and also to Professor Tegmark. Brilliant questions, completely fascinating answers, and really incredible audience engagement. Thanks especially to Professor Tegmark for my take-home message from the cutting edge stage, which I actually wrote down to make democracy flourish with AI, we have to develop tools that we can give away for free. The power of AI doesn't have to be something that only the big guys have control of. Thank you so much to everyone. You'll all be sad to know that our virtual time is over for CogX 2021. What an extraordinary collection of ideas and dialogue. From AI's impact on healthcare to probabilistic programming, neural networks to policymaking to the hope of a better media landscape, the cutting edge stage has been absolutely phenomenal. Again, I have to offer huge thanks to our sponsors, Accenture, BT, Visa, and Quantum Black, for supporting CogX 2021, and for you all engaging in our hybrid festival, whichever way you chose to connect. If you found inspiration in any of these areas or ideas, please share them on social media using the hashtag CogX 2021. But also you can return tomorrow. Whilst there won't be any cutting edge stage, there is still a brilliant collection of speakers and events. If you want to know more about the plans for tomorrow, hop on over to the website where you'll find the full schedule. Okay, that's enough from me. Thank you so much for your engagement, for your commitment to building a better world with a tech-enabled world, which offers a brighter future for all. And thanks again so much to Dr. Singler and also to Professor Tegmark for such an incredible end to what has been a fantastic 2 days.